I'm Bob McGrath. I'm the Provost here at Stony Brook University. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to Stony Brook for this second annual Stony Brook Human Evolution Symposium and Workshop. Stony Brook has a long tradition of excellence in primate evolution and human origins, and has broadened out in the last decade to include strength in primatology and in Stone Age archaeology. When Richard Leakey agreed to join our faculty in 2002, it seemed a natural idea for him to work with colleagues in anatomical sciences and anthropology to organize a series of symposia and workshops on human evolution. And this is the second one of those. The planning committee, consisting of Richard, John Flegel, Fred Grein, Lawrence Martin, and John Shea, all faculty here at Stony Brook, identified three initial topics concerning the evolution of our genus Homo that they felt would benefit from in-depth discussion and exchange of ideas. We wanted to share with our students and faculty and others from the region the ideas brought to these workshops with an opening symposium that's open to all this morning's session. We're most grateful to the speakers and to the panelists for this morning's event. Last year's symposium and workshop addressed the origin of anatomically modern humans in Africa. We call it Out of Africa 2. This year's topic is Out of Africa 1, the first human migration out of Africa and the first evidence for humans in Asia and Europe. Stony Brook is one of the nation's great public research universities, but it's difficult in the current economic climate for public universities like Stony Brook to be able to put on events such as this one without the generous support of foundations and private individuals. We're therefore particularly grateful to Bill and Kathy Cleary, Mrs. Kay Harrington Woods, Marilyn and Jim Simons, Richard Goldman, and to the Leakey Foundation for their generous sponsorship of this symposium and workshop. It's now my pleasure to introduce our colleague, Professor Richard Leakey, who will describe his hopes for this year's workshop and symposium. Richard?
Good morning, everybody. Let me say what a pleasure it is to see the second of these conferences starting. Bob McGrath alluded to 3. We are, in fact, planning a much longer series than that, and I think at this stage we have at least 5 planned. And hopefully, as a result of the first 5, things will have changed so much that we'll have to do them all over again and see if there has been any progress. I think part of the idea of this series is to reach out and bring a number of people together who meet and often talk at each other, but seldom talk to each other. And I think today there was an opportunity for the speakers to talk. And normally at the end of the day, after the panel discussion, some questions and some hopefully good wine, everyone would leave tomorrow, but I'm not sure we would have moved the process further forward. The difference between this conference and many others that have been held is that the idea is to take the speakers over the next 4 days and in semi-seclusion and hopefully a very informal context, put away the papers, put away the preconceived notions as to the importance of what they said yesterday, and start a real discussion about what we don't know and why we know what we know, and hopefully get to a point where there is clearly a new challenge to answer a series of questions that have always been there but haven't necessarily been clearly identified. I think back to, and perhaps it's inappropriate to think back, but I tend to do that, to the conference last year on the modern human story. And I remember the opening session where a number of speakers gave very confident statements about what things were and why they were, at what age they were, and how it was really quite a straightforward story. There was a little bit of disagreement here and there, but it was something that you could feel very good about at the end of the day. By the end of the fourth day, most of those sandcastles had eroded, and many of the ideas that had been put forth on the first day were now subject to quite serious question as to whether we had the knowledge that we appeared to have when we started. And I think there are, frankly, some very important points for discussion at this symposium. If you look at it from afar, and I have largely backed away from the science for the last 15, 20 years, there seems to be a circularity to some of the discussions. And I hope that this particular discussion, Out of Africa 1, will focus sharply on Out of Africa and what we really know about those hominids. When is the first hominid found out of Africa? What are the ages of the various fossils that are often compared loosely to each other and referred back to an African template? Do we really know how old these are? What is the possibility for identifying taxa on fragments from different diverse sites outside of Africa where you have fewer fossils? How much confidence do we have in some of the assumptions that have been carried for years now? And I hope that that will be part of this. Obviously, we need to set the ground, and we set the ground this morning. I think there's some fascinating talks that will come up this morning that will set a context not only for the larger audience, but will also, I think, set the scene for the debates that will follow. And unfortunately, one can't include everybody in those discussions. I think a lot of people, certainly referring to myself, you tend to say certain things when you're in a big audience, and you can be persuaded to say other things when you're in a smaller crowd. And I think we really need to get the smaller crowd dynamics to move this science forward. And that's what I see as very, very valuable behind this. I think the other point that I'd like to make is that there has been a general sense that over the last 50 to 100 years, so much has been done that we must surely know about the ancestry of humanity. And I have to confess that I think we surely don't know. There's so much more to be learned and so much refinement that is appropriate to determining the actual story. And I think as we move forward, it is clear that the opportunities for new research, the opportunities for young men and women to open up old sites and to find new sites, to apply new techniques is important. The other thing that I think is particularly fascinating is that the Out of Africa story is now supported by a considerably larger body of data. There's more specimens than ever before. There's more information about the context of those specimens. And I think much more importantly, there's a whole cadre of new scientists, younger people, who have not been brought up on the traditions of the old prejudices. And there are people now from Indonesia, there are people from China, there are people from India, there are people from Pakistan, there are people from Africa, who are coming at this with a slightly different approach, which may in itself take us a little further forward. And I have to say that the opportunity offered by Stony Brook to do these conferences is really very, very significant, and I do appreciate Provost McGrath, the fact that the university has put a lot of resources and time into this program, and I think those on the faculty all recognize that a lot has gone into this from your side of the formula. We appreciate it, so I thank you on their behalf. We don't always thank you in public, but we're going to thank you now. The last thing I would say is that there will be a panel discussion. We want to make it participatory. We would like people to raise questions. And I'm going to stick my chin out and say, when you hear a fairy tale, it's the best opportunity to ask questions afterwards. And that's what you're going to hear a lot of today. A lot of ideas, a lot of good stories, but prod a bit from the audience and from the panel. Let's start the process of why. Are you sure? Why are you contradicting yourself in two parts of your talk? Let's get at some of these issues. And if we can, stick to the focus, which is out of Africa. It's going to be very tempting, particularly for the speakers, to fall back into Africa, where there's a lot more information, there's a lot more tradition. But I really hope, as convener, that we can keep the greater part of this discussion into what do we know about the non-African story as it's represented by the various speakers and specimens here. So with those very brief remarks, I would now ask Professor Bill Jungers to come up and to introduce the speakers themselves. If you do that, Bill, I'd be very grateful. So please come. Thanks.
Good morning. We're a little ahead of schedule, but I suspect the first speaker can take full advantage of that. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones, beepers, anything else that's likely to make noise, small children, before we get started. After this morning's presenters, I will invite some distinguished members of the panel to come up, and following their comments, we will welcome questions from the audience. I would just tell the audience now, please keep your questions short and to the point, and wait for us to bring a microphone to you. We'll have mics on either side. Having said that, it's my great pleasure again to introduce the first speaker of this morning, Dr. Marta Lahr from Cambridge University, who'll be speaking about Out of Africa Again and Again.
Thank you, William, Richard, and thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to talk at Stony Brook again. I'm slightly nervous, because I was one of the speakers last year who told these wonderful stories that then didn't survive the 4 days. I prepared a talk that's largely about Africa, and we're told not to. And so, anyway, bear with me. So we're here at this meeting to look at Out of Africa, what we call Out of Africa 1. And Out of Africa 1 is about dispersals of hominins when they first colonized the world. And to put it in context, what I'm going to do is actually give you a very broad introduction to the issue of the first hominin dispersals. I will refrain from confident statements. Okay, so the starting point to our problem is that we know hominins evolved in Africa. And we have, like Richard said, a beautiful record, although it could be better. And we also know that for the first 3 million years of that evolution, they never left sub-Saharan Africa. It might even be more than that, but we think it's about that. So for 3 million years, hominins lived in East Africa, eventually also in South Africa, but they did not live beyond that area. And then this happened. The arrows are a particular pleasure. All paleoanthropologists love putting these arrows that cross whole continents. We don't know at all. So what we have after 2 million years, we have hominins in the Middle East. We have hominins probably in Pakistan. We have hominins in Southeast Asia. We have sites without fossils, but with archaeology in North Africa. A bit later, we have sites in Iberia. And we also have these orange things, which are sites with lots of archaeology, but the dates are really, well, not firm at the moment. So this is what we're here trying to explain. What happened? Why? They lived 3 million years quite happily in sub-Saharan Africa. They had a niche, they had a space, they behaved like any normal species, and then they went bang. And this bang, I would argue, that is not just that dispersal, that it grew into an actual part of their own adaptation, because they dispersed many times. And the end result of those dispersals is the total colonization of the world. I took that from the web, is the United States at night, completely filled up with people. So we have to get to that point. We have to be able to explain what changed so that our ancestors went from being a normal African ape, or groups of apes, several species, from one that could take over the world. So then I started thinking, okay, let's think, what makes creatures disperse? And they disperse for various reasons. They disperse because it reduces competition among your fellow kin. It reduces competition between parents and offspring. It also reduces inbreeding. It reduces local overcrowding. And you can go on and go on and go on. And the end result is that dispersal is the answer to a problem. So our problem is then to figure out what the problem was. They were happy, I hope, for 3 million years in sub-Saharan Africa. So what drove them to leave? So we have to identify what is the problem, what was the cause behind this major change. Then we can break that down and think, was the problem new or the solution new? Was it a new solution to a problem that had existed before? Or was the problem entirely new? I will ignore that for a minute. Then we can also say, okay, yes, we saw the picture of the United States at night. And we could say, well, but they took 2 million years to get there. So what stopped them? So if they could go very quickly to Java, why not South America? I mean, what stopped them? What constrained them? And they did. Our early hominins, they do leave Africa, but they don't go all the way. They really had constraints to as far as they could go. So we want to know what those were. Then we want to know if it was successful. And yeah, we can say we're standing here, so it must have been. But in a shorter term, in the actual evolutionary sense for those creatures, then obviously, what were the consequences? And I want to end asking, why Africa? Sorry. Okay. So the starting point in our discussion for dispersals, I wanted to say the dispersal is not a migration. A migration is the movement of creatures, usually from within a given range and recurrent. So in this case of these birds, they have a breeding range. They also have a winter range, and they migrate every year. Dispersal is different. Dispersal is an open-ended process. And what lies behind is the search for new foraging grounds. So when animals disperse, they change the range the species occupies. In order to do so, it has to include a breeding unit. It has to be viable. If a dispersal is just a quick extension of that range, but whoever is left behind, they're not enough to survive, then it wasn't. It was a short expansion. For dispersal to have taken place, you have to have established daughter populations. And for that, you need a breeding unit. The kin structure is something interesting, because one of the issues with dispersal is that how it promotes or underlies differentiation. And one of the aspects that we know from people dispersing, and it's one of the issues of migrations and refugees today, is that people disperse in kin structure groups, so that you actually go in groups that are already related or seek them. And then the fact that dispersals may include jump dispersals, so the use of very fast corridors to get somewhere else. So I want to briefly look at how do we go about investigating this. And we are at an age in which genetics, it's all predominant. And this year, we had the most amazing publication, only less than a month ago, of the chimpanzee genome. And it's amazing what we find now in that genome. We can look at differences. We can look at how chimpanzees and humans resolve genetically, biologically, some very basic functions. I've also heard, and other people in this audience were present as well, that they've started mapping, sequencing the Neanderthal genome. So we will know even more. Quite amazing. So what does genetics, how has genetics actually impacted into what we do? And I'll use this graph, which is the relationships of the entire mitochondrial genome in living apes. So we have orangutans here, gorillas, chimpanzees, and here humans. And the size, the length of those branches and how far apart they are, it's a measure of how much diversity there is among individuals. So we can immediately see that humans have very little diversity, and this has been one of the big lessons from genetics. But focusing on our question today, with genetics, we can tell about human-human differences. We can also tell about human-chimpanzee differences. But the events that are either between the separation of ancestors of chimpanzees and humans, all the separations of humans from humans, we can't. So we're dealing with a particular problem that will not be resolved through disciplines that infer the past from the present. So genetics, neurobiology, linguistics, evolutionary, it will not help us. These disciplines use present distributions and present patterns to infer what happened before. We're dealing with an event that is not represented there. So we actually will depend for this of our traditional tools in paleoanthropology. We need measures. These are lithoforaminifera, they're minute bugs that die and go to the bottom of the ocean. And through them, we can actually reconstruct paleotemperatures. So that's one of the most important things we can do is actually come to reconstruct how the climate changed through time. We have paleontologists in the room. You will hear Meave talk more later. Archaeology, Paleolithic archaeology, and the study of human fossils. Those are our tools for dealing with the first dispersals of hominins out of Africa. And I think that we also need the right theory. And for me, this is not everybody will agree, I think the theory is about evolutionary geography. Evolution happens in time, but it also happens in space. And because the conditions through time change, the situation of any species in space changes as well. So it is the interaction of time and space that we call evolutionary geography that will actually serve as the theory, the framework in which we study and say, okay, we have a population. It can either expand or contract. It can come out with different outcomes of both these processes, but it will certainly be changing through time, both in space and its own physical features. So if we look now at what we're talking about, this is adapted from a graph published by Eitan Chernov, the late Eitan Chernov, who worked on dispersals out of Africa for many, many years. And what he drew was what a dispersal looks like. So we have space in this dimension, time in this dimension. And a dispersal starts with a small group. It could involve a bottleneck, what we call like real constriction of the diversity, or not. Many people argue it does. It's followed by an expansion of the range. And then they can have what they call the jump dispersals. The creatures will take a corridor. They cannot live in that corridor, but they will use that corridor, and they will reach another area that is where they can actually settle. But because of our space-time dynamics, that corridor will not be open for a very long time. So you will end up with a daughter population now physically separated from the parental one. And that's when dispersals have happened. So this is, oh, I'm sorry, this is one of those statements. Ignore it. So what is the problem? What caused those dispersals? And I'm sure that a lot of the academics in this room will disagree. They each will have a different opinion and will happily argue for the next 4 days. I actually think it was overcrowding. And I think the overcrowding was driven by a change in the competitive circumstances of hominins around 2 million years ago. We know the climate is changing. I seem to lose this. The climate changes quite dramatically from 2.5 million years onward, getting cooler. You can see this is hot this end, cold that end. So we can see a cooling trend in the last few million years. And then when we reach the last million, the magnitude, the amplitude of the variation is enormous. That's a particular moment in time. But I think that what happened in Africa, is that you're actually working with the situation of forests and deserts. And it's the twin effects of forests and deserts that actually shapes the barriers of these populations. And I think that in East Africa at that time, you had a cooling effect, the growth of the establishment actually of the Sahara as a barrier, and the Arabia Peninsula as a desert barrier as well. But you also have from time to time the growth of forests into East Africa, changing the dynamics in which the hominins are competing. And one option was to actually move out of Africa. But we'll come back to that in a minute. So how does climate actually get to there? A lot of people think that climate is the driver for evolution. And I would disagree with that, because I think that climate actually affects the habitat, not the evolutionary response. You cannot predict the evolutionary response from climate. You can predict if the habitat will be worse or better. And then you can have a number of outcomes from that. And in terms of our out of Africa, just to return to what we were saying earlier, you have this onset of global glaciation about 2.5 million years ago, and most critically, the establishment of the grasslands in East Africa. And this probably changed quite dramatically the adaptations, the diet of these hominins. And it probably, I'm using probably a lot, it also underlies the radiation of hominins. We have a lot of many different hominins at that time. But I think there were many other dispersals in these last 2 million years, and we'll go back to that. To give you a measure of what climatic change did in Africa recurrently, I will use, this is data for the last, a reconstruction of the Sahara about 10,000 years ago. And in black, they're river drainages. These areas here are the formation of the mega lakes of the Sahara. So from time to time, almost 10% of the Sahara was underwater. That doesn't mean the Sahara was green, but it means that there were corridors that they could use. So these major climatic changes have actually altered the shape of corridors and barriers in the last 2 million years. So going back to our question, was the problem new or the solution new? I don't have the answer to that, and I hope we'll discuss that a lot in the next week. I think that the problem was probably not new in the sense that hominins, the climate is always changing. The environment is always changing. We have dispersals of hominins. Earlier, Australopithecines actually established a population in Chad, which is 2,000 kilometers away. So dispersals had already happened along corridors. So the problem is not entirely new. But what is new, perhaps, is the magnitude of it. After 2.5 million years ago, the magnitude of climatic change is different. You also have that after 2.5 million years ago, a marked change in the hominins themselves. We have many new forms, and we have this issue of the grasslands. So the background to the problem is different. And the solution certainly was a different one. So in the last slide, I'm implying, without putting too much emphasis, that part of the solution they found was actually to increase the amount of meat they ate, to increase the proportion of meat in their diet. And it was, I would argue, that it was only after they did that that they could really colonize these drastically different environments. But having said that, this is one of the things that falls exactly in Richard's category of strongest statement. We know that there are a number of biological and behavioral aspects of the genus Homo, and ourselves included, that are very closely related. What increased meat eating is related to more energy for brain growth. We also know that our guts are smaller than they should be. And people have argued, quite nicely, that there's been an exchange, an energetic exchange in our bodies between guts and brains. Quite glad that that happened, yeah. We also are quite peculiar in which we have increased the size of our brain, which consumes vast amounts of our energy, especially as children, without changing our basal metabolic rate. So that you get this energetic triangle that involves having a high quality, a high energy diet. So meat eating is crucially there. But also, if you are a meat eater, you'll see here, you have much larger ranges. So this graph has the log area of a species and the number of species. And we can see that if you're a carnivore, you have fewer species, fewer groups per area. They occupy a larger area. So we know that meat eating is related to the expansion of these ranges. We also know that actually the area covered relates to body size. And we can then take body size to brain size through a feedback effect with ontogeny. And of course, if you're growing slowly and bigger brains, it will end up having an effect on cognition. So when I say, oh, I think it was carnivory, that is a bit of a bold statement. We don't know. We don't know. We have an adaptive package that created a new, different sort of creature. And that was the creature that left Africa. I don't think the package was all there at the same time. I mentioned earlier that one of the problems that we have to try to understand is that what stopped them going all the way? They didn't go to South America until about 12,000 years ago. And the answer there is that we do not know. We haven't really explored what were the constraints on these early hominins. We're so fascinated with the fact that suddenly they could take on journeys of thousands of kilometers that we haven't really asked, why 5,000 and not 10? Why all the way to Southeast Asia, but not really into Siberia? So that question is one that we have to discuss, and I'm sure we'll be discussing this week. We have issues. At the end, they did go all these places, but a lot of the places they had to cross were very dry. So there's the obvious issue of fresh water. We know that occupation of the Sahara and the Arabian Peninsula could only happen in those short windows of time when there were water corridors. So water is an obvious constraint. They probably had also a constraint of finding raw material for their stone tools. All this sort of breaks apart in Southeast Asia, where they didn't have rocks and there's no obvious standing water and so on. So this is an aspect that we still have a lot to learn about. Then I asked earlier, were they successful? And I think the answer here has to be yes. These are fossils. If we were to put stone tools, we could fill this map enormously. The first dispersals out of Africa did establish populations way outside the ancestral range, and some of those populations survived for hundreds of thousands of years. Others, I think, they went extinct almost right away. But some of them survived for a long time. So there is no doubt that those early dispersals were successful. One of, I think, my last question, but well, no, I still have why Africa, was what is the consequence, or what were the consequences of hominins changing completely the dimensions of the range they occupied And for me, the strongest consequences is that it causes a structure in a species. We call a structure when a species is divided in units. And then what happens is that differentiation within those units increases the variability of the species as a whole. So it's an extremely important evolutionary process when you actually create a structure within a species. And we did that through dispersals. We also have a history that I think underlies these dispersal events of very dramatic demographic fluctuations, for going from being a very large, happy group, expanded, to actually the environment driving fragmentation of that range, ending up in smaller units, some which disappear, some which will then change dramatically. The smaller the breeding unit, the faster evolution acts. So I think that that underlying demography is one of the consequences, or it's both cause and consequence of what we are studying. And the best of it is that then it gives evolution room to create wonderful things. So the consequences of one of the consequences of dispersals is these unique creatures that have evolved in our planet. So these, we have all heard recently about Homo floresiensis, the little creature from Southeast Asia that is hardly more than a meter tall. That could not have happened if those first out of Africa dispersals had not happened, if this creature had then further dispersed into an island and got stuck in it. We also have here a Neanderthal skeleton and a human skeleton. That could only have happened because one evolved in Europe and the other one in Africa, exactly at the same time. It happened because of dispersals, these opportunities that under different selective pressures, creatures will evolve their own fascinating ways. And we have that even within our own species. I just chose one example in terms of height. These are all living humans. These two men come from Congo, this man from Papua New Guinea, this man from the Philippines. He was a European explorer. That again can only happen through geographical differentiation. And that is one of the most wonderful consequences of this out of Africa 1 dispersals. So I will end asking why Africa? And this is a question that many of us have asked before, and that again, people will provide you with different answers. My interpretation is that again, is the particular evolutionary geography of Africa that made it a source for dispersals again and again. The effects of deserts and forests, creating both very different environments and also fragments, mosaic environments. Those mosaic environments with this extraordinary level of climatic change that drove population differentiation in Africa, drove the evolution of innovations in small groups that then got exported out. But I'm sure we'll hear of different views from others. Thank you very much.
The second presentation in this morning's symposium is by Dr. Meave Leakey, Stony Brook University. She'll be speaking about African mammals, background to dispersal. Meave?
Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, I must say. And in spite of the fact that my title is African Mammals, and in spite of the fact that Richard has been saying to me, I don't know why you're here, you're talking about Africa, I'm really honored. And I do believe myself that it's important to have the background. And without the background in Africa, thanks very much, you can't really understand why things moved out of Africa and why it all happened in any case. So thankfully, quite by chance, Richard has had to go anyway. So I'm free to talk how I wish and to say what I wish. And he'll never know what I said either. So I'm really going to address today the different mammals and what they were doing and how human ancestors related to these mammals. And I'm going to deal in three groups, really. First of all, the primates, and then the carnivores, and then the herbivores. And these are really the groups that have different adaptive strategies and affected hominids, and hominids affected them in different ways. Basically, when you're talking about any faunal assemblage, you have two sorts of animals: animals that eat other animals and animals that are eaten themselves. And so the main evolutionary pressures are either to stop being eaten or to be successful at eating. And these are important differences, and they're important differences when you come to look at humans. Oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. And this is because humans actually change their strategy. The simplistic view that you always see of this humans going from bipedality to going from being quadrupedal to bipedal is a very simplistic view, and of course lots happened in between. But one of the most important things was actually the development of culture. The ability our ancestors suddenly developed to make their own stone tools. And today, the technology we have is a direct repercussion from that original development. But that original development actually changed the adaptive strategy of the humans, and their whole life history pattern and everything altered at that point. So we find the earliest stone tools at 2.5 million years. And at that point, we see not just early artifacts, but also cut marks on the bones that are left in the archaeological sites, which show that the hominids were bashing the bones to get the marrow out, as well as cutting the meat off. And so at that time, hominids began eating meat. This stone tool technology changed the dietary strategy, as I was saying, and this led to several differences in human evolution. It led to an increased body size, it led to an increased home range, and it led to dietary flexibility. By eating meat, you move into a completely different niche, and as Marta Lahr was explaining, this is important in terms of dispersal mechanisms. So it's believed, and we're told that we're all going to be questioning everything, but it is believed, and I think it is true, actually. I think it's a fact that Homo erectus was the first species to migrate out of Africa. Now, when this happened may well be discussed in detail to come, but at the moment it's believed to be about 1.8 million, or just less than 1.8 million years ago. When it actually happened, and the details of that are not so important to the factors that I'm addressing, and so we'll move on. But what do we know about Homo erectus? And actually we know a lot. We know more about Homo erectus than any other species of early human ancestors. We have more examples of this species and more good specimens of skulls, and even a complete skeleton, the Turkana boy, to tell us about what this species was doing. Recently at Turkana, we found this skull at the bottom here, which is, in many ways, when we first looked at it, looks different because it's A, very small, B, doesn't have very well-developed brow ridges. Its general shape, it has a marked keeling along the top of the skull. So in many ways, it sort of bridged gaps between Homo erectus outside of Africa and Homo erectus in Africa. And it made us look very carefully at what features actually represent Homo erectus and what don't. In analyzing the skull, I've been working with Fred Spohr and with Susan Anton. And Fred and Susan have gone into a lot of details in looking at different specimens of Homo erectus to see how much is variation in this species and how much is actually specific distinction. And with a good sample like this, you can look at many different characters and find out. The sample that we have now in East Africa is 10 good skulls, and outside Africa, in Asia, there's at least 35, probably a few more. So with this big sample, you can actually take measurements of different aspects of the skull. You can look at different things in detail, and you can come up with a very good quantitative analysis that gives you a good idea of which features are actually representative of Homo erectus and which are not. Again, this is definitely going to be questioned in the next few days, but since we're not allowed to talk about African erectus, it's not so important in terms of the following discussions, at least when Richard's in the room. So looking at these characters, Fred and Susan have found that the valley characters in particular are the profile at the back of the skull, which has this bun shape, which has always been considered to be a very erectus feature. Keeling along the top of the skull, although it's not found in all the African specimens, is also an erectus feature. And the angle of the joint where the mandible articulates with the skull, and the angle, the petrotympanic angle, although that is shown there, are also good features. Invalid features, on the other hand, are things like skull thickness, that you can see measured here on a CT scan, the thickness of the supraorbital torus, that's the brow ridges, which are often discussed. Nobody really knows what they're for and why they're there. But this is a size-related feature, and therefore it's not necessarily a Homo erectus feature. You can find it in other things as well. And the curvature at the back of the skull is another invalid feature when you look at this in detail. So at the end of this study, we have concluded that our skull was indeed a Homo erectus, in spite of what we wondered. And it was of a sub-adult, it's a young adult, it's not completely adult. And the differences that we see in the morphology reflect its size as well as its age. So having this good sample, we really can tell a lot about Homo erectus and look at then other things that are related. So let's now look at key events in human evolution and how they affect the other mammals and how the other mammals may have affected the humans. And you can get into very circular arguments here. But first of all, hominids are in the primate niche. They are prey animals. They are eaten by the carnivores. They have no outstanding defense because they didn't have stone tools. But with the appearance of stone tools, hominids then move into the carnivore niche and they become predators. And this, of course, affects both the monkeys and it affects the carnivores and it affects the other herbivores. So this is what we're now going to look at. Again, approximately 1.8, Homo moved out of Africa, and that is once it becomes a predator. So I think this move is really important in terms of Homo erectus dispersal. So prior to the appearance of stone tools, Homo erectus was an integral part of the primate fauna. It was competing directly with the monkeys because we don't have good evidence of fossil apes. Only a couple of weeks ago, the first fossil chimpanzee was announced, which was an exciting landmark, but there's only one. So we're only really looking at fossil monkeys. And at that time, hominids were very much co-occurring with monkeys. If you find a fossil monkey, you're likely to find a fossil hominid, and they were very much part of that whole dietary niche. After, when hominids were prey, they were constrained by restraints as of other primates. So like all catarrhines, they were originally only found in the tropics. So you find them in East Africa, and close to the equator, although you do find them also in South Africa. The food resources are relatively stable, and the diet was probably very similar to that of modern chimpanzees, and their primary competitors at that time were monkeys. Once they became predators, everything changed, and they became part of the carnivore guild. They came into direct competition with carnivores, and they fully utilized the source of meat provided by all the herbivores. So we'll look at these three different groups in turn. So key events in Cercopithecid evolution is interesting because I think it's reflecting very much what happened with the hominids. Initially, before the appearance of stone tools, you have adaptive radiation of monkeys. So At that time, suddenly you get a lot of new species of monkeys appearing, and these monkeys are very diverse, and they're also quite large in many cases. So they were very distinctive in many ways. At 1.6 to 0.5, these monkeys gradually die off, and then you get the appearance of the modern monkeys, which are small and very different from the earlier adaptive radiation. So it appears that competition with hominids, once they became predators, was probably significant in the evolution of monkeys. So summarizing that, they went in a species radiation between 3.5 and 2, and this is most clearly seen in the columbines, when there was a diversity of large-bodied, largely terrestrial columbines. And we have records of really some beautiful skeletons of these things, and from the skeletons we've been able to interpret their mode of locomotion and what they were doing, and surprisingly, they were largely terrestrial, unlike modern columbines. So they were large-bodied and largely terrestrial. Here you have a reconstruction of one of these columbines compared to a modern colobus monkey, and you can see it really was a very big animal. The other thing about columbines is that they have a ruminant-like stomach, like antelopes and other bovids. So this gives them a big advantage over other monkeys, and probably also it gave them a big advantage over hominids at the time. They have a ruminant-like fermentation chamber, which allows them to derive energy from low-quality vegetation. It allows them to get by with low drinking water requirements and a lower basal metabolic rate. And it allows them to inhabit a wider variety of environments than many other monkeys. So this ruminant stomach was important in the success of this great radiation of fossil columbines. At the same time, there's another monkey which is related to the modern gelada baboon. And here you see modern geladas feeding in Ethiopia. They live in huge troops, but their special thing about them is that they're specialized grass eaters. They exist almost entirely on grass. And this is very unusual, again, for a monkey. When it's dry, they eat the grass seeds, and when it's very dry, they eat the grass roots, and after the rains, they love the little grass shoots. So they are specialized grass eaters, which in the Pliocene and late Pliocene, early Pleistocene, were very, very common. They're very widespread, and you find them in nearly all fossil sites in East Africa. So this species is a particularly well-known common species due to its specialization in grass eating. And this species is one of the mammals that we know that may have migrated out of Africa at about the same time as Homo erectus. We don't know for sure because the dates of the occurrences are not entirely good, but it is known from Southeast and North Africa, Levant, Italy, Spain, India, many sites outside of Africa. And it makes a good candidate for a species that may have moved out of Africa at the same time. The competition from monkeys, and particularly from Pteropithecus, may have contributed to the hominid move from the omnivore to the carnivore feeding niche. So, but it's hard to say, is that what's actually happening, or the hominids actually influencing the other animals? You don't know, but it's an interplay between all the different species that actually affect what animals do. The carnivores, when hominids moved from the carnivore to the herbivore to the carnivore dietary niche, hominids then came into direct competition with carnivores, as seen in this rather dramatic reconstruction here. How successful they were, we don't know, and what they were actually doing, we don't know. But I would imagine that initially they were scavenging from carcasses, and then as they really developed meat eating as a way of life, they would have then begun to become killers. However, we don't know when this happened, and we don't know at what point it happened. But in any event, when they moved into the carnivore niche, hominids became very much key competitors with other carnivores. And this, of course, affected carnivore evolution. And there's a lot of interesting things developed among the carnivores at this time. So let's see what was going on with the carnivores. 3.5 million you had a time of, again, a big radiation of carnivores and many large-bodied, specialized and generalized carnivores living at that time. Here's, and again, reconstructions just to show you some of the things that were living. And you see in the Pleistocene, the diversity dies off, and the saber-tooths particularly are affected. So here again, you see the diversity at 3.6, 3.3 is maximum. Again, it comes up again at 2.1, but then really it's dying off towards the present time. So what happened after hominids moved into the carnivore niche is you get a large extinction of carnivores. And this happened between 1.8 and 1.5 million. And again, may have been a direct result of the hominids moving in and competing with the carnivores. And so as you go up in time, you lose all the specialized carnivores and you come into a land of large-bodied generalists. So you get many more of the lions, cheetahs, these types of carnivores, and less of the saber-tooths. Or the saber-tooths eventually become extinct. Here are some reconstructions of carnivore specialists. These are all various types of saber-tooth. Dinophilis, interestingly enough, is the least specialized and lived the longest. It became extinct after the more developed saber-tooth cats. So here's the last appearance of some of the specialized carnivores, Homotherium and Meganterion and Dinophilis and Chasmopathetes, all become extinct in the last between 1.8 and roughly 1 million years. And this, again, I think has a lot to do with competition from carnivores. So now let's look at the herbivores. There was, again, an enormous diversity of herbivores at this time, and particularly prior to hominids becoming meat eaters. If you look at them this in detail, you see that the elephants, today you have one species of elephant in East Africa. At that time there were 3. Hippos, one species today, 3 at about 2 million. Giraffids, 3, and I don't know why, there's a mistake here, I beg your pardon, that should be 3, should actually be a 1, there's only 1 giraffe living today. Suids were 6, and they became 3. Equids, again, were 6, and then now, today, you only have the Grevy zebra and the Burchell zebra. And the large-bodied, large hominids, I can't list them all because there's so many of them, but there were many more species again, and today, compared to the depauperate diversity that you see today. So the diversity in the herbivores was really enormous in the past, and this cannot have been entirely due to vegetation. It must also have been due to what was going on with the faunal that was actually living at the time. As Marta Lahr was showing us in a very explicit slide, there was a general trend of drying and opening environments within this time of 4 to 1.3 million years. And that, again, would have had effect on the animals that were living through this time period. And that would have decreased the diversity to a certain extent, and would have been another factor that needs to be considered. So looking now at the herbivores, and there's a greater diversity of herbivores before the appearance of stone tools, which becomes less and less with time as the hominids become better and better predators. If you look also at archaeological sites, this gives you some idea of what the early humans were eating. And the remains in archaeological sites show clearly that hominids were really utilizing this plentiful source of meat that is available from the herbivores. They were eating from a large range of body sizes, from very small to as large as elephants. And they were also eating a large diversity of different species, so that they were obviously affecting all these animals as well. So summarizing what the points we've been making, that in catarrhines, the monkeys, the Miocene migrations were exclusively out of Africa, whereas in the Pleistocene, there are only two species that moved out of Africa, and that is Pteropithecus and Homo erectus. So there was a difference there in terms of migrations and dispersal out of Africa. It's possible that Pteropithecus dispersed out of Africa at the same time as Homo erectus. We don't know. The first appearance of Pteropithecus in Europe, which is quite well dated, is 1.4 million years. Carnivore dispersal, again, in contrast to monkeys, Miocene migrations were mainly into Africa rather than out of Africa, whereas Pleistocene migrations are almost exclusively out of Africa, but they involve the large-bodied taxa largely. Crocuta, the hyena, and Megantereon, the saber-toothed, may have migrated out of Africa at the same time as Homo erectus. Again, we don't know for sure, and it depends on good dates outside Africa, but those are two species that could qualify as having migrated out at the same time. The first appearance of Crocuta in Europe is 0.9, and I think it's thought that it may have occurred elsewhere slightly earlier than that. If you look at the herbivores, there are very few species, again, among the herbivores that migrated at the same time as Homo. So there were not many species that are dispersing contemporaneously with Homo erectus. So the hominid change in feeding niche favored dispersal, and I think it was really a key factor in the event when Homo erectus moved out of Africa. And this is because it led to an increase in home range, an increase in body size, and it led to dietary flexibility. And all these things mean that it becomes much easier for species to disperse and to move out. So both carnivores and monkeys were significantly affected by this change in the hominids, and their evolution was very much modified by what was going on with the hominids. Monkeys that were previously hominin competitors became hominid prey, and carnivores that were previously hominin predators became hominid competitors. And herbivore diversity decreased considerably, but did provide a good source of food. So just to end, thanks to many colleagues, and I've drawn on many colleagues' data, obviously, to talk about these things, but particularly Mauricio Anton, who did all the diagrams, Susan Anton, and they're not related, René Bobet, Louise Leakey, Nina Javanci, Margaret Lewis, Fred Spohr, and Lahr Berdelin. And thanks also to all the other colleagues who I know are going to be greatly influencing my thinking in the next 4 days in any event. So probably if I were to give this talk 4 days from now, it would be completely different. And apologies for talking about Africa, but thank goodness Richard wasn't here to hear it.
All right, pressing on to the last presentation of this morning before the panel discussion. John Shea, also of Stony Brook, will be discussing the Levant, a corridor, and a cul-de-sac. John, let me get you set up.
The term Levant refers to the countries comprising the eastern watershed of the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan Rift Valley. So this includes the modern-day countries of the southern part of Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Jordan, and the Sinai province of Egypt. Since 20 million years ago, the East Mediterranean Levant has been a land bridge connecting Northeast Africa to Southwest Asia. And as we've just heard, during that time, countless animal species have made this crossing. The earliest evidence for human ancestors having done so, making this crossing that is, dates to between 1 and 2 million years ago. Subsequent evidence for hominin and human population transits into the Levant from Africa and Eurasia are known from virtually every prehistoric period and historical epoch. The Levant has been such a crossroad of the continents that the archaeologist Ofer Bar Yosef refers to it as the central bus station of old world prehistory. If one travels in this region today, one quickly learns the bus station can be a place through which one passes effortlessly or a place in which one lingers for prolonged periods of time. This invites the question, maybe the kind of question you think about when you're waiting for a bus. Was the East Mediterranean Levant a corridor that facilitated human dispersals northward out of Africa? Or was it a cul-de-sac, literally a dead end for dispersing hominid populations? In this lecture, I'm going to focus on three of the flagship Levantine Lower Paleolithic sites. The Lahr elephant site, which dates to about 2.2 million years ago. Ubeidiya, which dates to about 1.4 million years ago. And Gesher Benat Yaakov, a third site that dates to around 0.8 million years ago. There are probably about a half dozen more sites plausibly dating to between 2 and 1 million years ago that I could add to this, but they don't really alter our picture of the human adaptations in this region, so I'm picking these three for the sake of brevity and because I've got nice pictures of them. Okay, let's look first at the Lahr Formation, Gesher Elephant Site. The site is provisionally dated to about 2.2 million years ago, primarily through biostratigraphy by comparing fossil assemblages from this site and other better dated occurrences, as well as by paleomagnetic studies of the Lahr sediments. There are no hominin fossils from this particular site. The Gesher Elephant Site is possibly the oldest archaeological site outside of Africa. Dating to 2.2 million years ago, it was discovered by the late Israeli paleontologist Eitan Chernov. Chernov worked for years at this site, recovering a largely complete skeleton of Mammuthus meridionalis tamanensis. And isolated elephant carcasses are not that unusual, but Chernov claimed that this site also featured evidence of human activity, which makes it particularly interesting and memorable, at least for the scope of this particular talk. Although I assisted Chernov in excavating Lahr elephant site, I'm still not sure really what to make of it. It is clearly a very complete elephant skeleton, but there are no cut marks, fractures, or other signs of human activity on these bones. Chernov claimed that he found stone tools associated with the skeleton, but most of these objects do not look like stone tools. They may be naturally fractured rock. Those that clearly are flake stone tools were found on or near the surface, and therefore they may date from more recent archaeological contexts. Let's turn now to Ubeidiya. Ubeidiya's age is generally assessed to about 1.5 million years ago, 1.4 by biostratigraphy, and other dating systems of paleomagnetism and radiopotassium constrain that age a little bit more broadly. Fossil remains from this site have been identified as Homo species indeterminate. Actually, Miriam Bellmaker, who's with us today, discovered some fossil remains from this site as well. So we're kind of guessing it's Homo erectus or Homo ergaster, but this is a job for the human hominid paleontologist to sort out. Me, I'm just an archaeologist. I just dig them up and bring them home. Excavation started at Ubeidiya in 1960, proceeded through the 1960s and 70s, and resumed in the 1990s. This is what the site looked like when I joined Chernov, Ofer Bar Yosef, and Claude Guérin in resuming excavations in 1992. The foreground shows the old excavation trenches from the earlier Israeli excavations. The background is the Tel Ubeidiya, after which the site takes its name. Swirling around old Tel Ubeidiya is the Jordan River, and in the background, Kibbutz Afikim, the kibbutzniks from Afikim found the site, and in the far background, Qais, the northwesternmost point in Jordan. The sediments at Ubeidiya, I have to show you this slide because I have to preface my remarks. Ubeidiya has some very weird stratigraphy. Most archaeologists know that levels are more or less horizontal. Well, at Ubeidiya, the sediments have been tipped almost 80 degrees off the horizontal plane by tectonic activity. So I have to tell you that so that when you look at my pictures of the excavation, you don't think I'm completely crazy. Completely, anyway. Many of these sediments also contain dense concentrations of basalt cobbles, stone tools, and fossils of large mammals. Initially, working with analogies to hunter-gatherer settlement patterns, archaeologists interpreted these cobble-rich floors as living floors, as if they were the occupation surfaces of prehistoric sites. Nowadays, we think it far more likely that these are fossil beaches, more or less like those one sees on the shores of the modern-day Lake Kinneret, or the Sea of Galilee. Our most recent excavations at Ubeidiya have focused on more muddy sediments in which bones and stone tools are better preserved. Fossil preservation in the non-conglomeratic layers of Ubeidiya is excellent. Recent excavations recovered nearly a full set of antlers of a new species of giant deer, a partly complete postcranial skeleton of an extinct hippopotamus, and the complete cranium of that same hippo species. Now, my students always know I pepper these lectures with funny stories. This species of hippopotamus is called Hippopotamus behemoth. And in Hebrew, behemoth, it means water buffalo. So the species name is Hippopotamus water buffalo. Somewhere up there in biologist heaven, Eitan and Linnaeus are having a great laugh about this particular one. The stone tool assemblages from Ubudiyya are strikingly similar to those from the middle of Olduvai Gorge bed too. They have few parallels, however, among like-aged lithic assemblages from Asia. Let's turn now to Gesher Benat Yaakov. Gesher Benat Yaakov is dated to between 0.7 and 0.9 million years ago through a combination of biostratigraphy, radiopotassium, paleomagnetism, and electron spin resonance dating. Fossil remains from this site have been identified to Homo erectus. Gesher Benat Yaakov is a site complex now located on the banks of the Jordan River near the old bridge to Syria. Until fairly recently, it was difficult to excavate here because the place was literally littered with landmines. At the time this site formed, however, it was actually a lakeshore, much like the same kind of lakeshore environment we see at Ubudiyya. Like Ubudiyya, the archaeological levels of Gesher Benat Yaakov have been tilted by tectonic activity, though not so severely. They also feature conglomeratic deposits reminiscent of beaches. These little open circles are blocks of basalt, and the closed shaded circles are stone tools. One level even features the cranium of an elephant with clear evidence for human modification. The excavator of the site, Namagoran Inbar from the Hebrew University, believes that this plank of wood here was a lever, used a crowbar-like device used to move the skull of this animal around. And surrounding it, you can see other bits and pieces of wood. This is also one of the distinctive features of Gesher Benat Yaakov. It's a waterlogged site and has preserved vegetal remains. This is highly unusual for early Paleolithic sites. Gesher Benat Yaakov also features evidence for such novel behaviors as the systematic processing of plant foods, nuts, and the controlled use of fire. Stones pitted from percussion occur in many of the levels at Gesher Benat Yaakov. Burnt micro-artifacts with small chips of stone also form clear clusters in at least two of the levels of Gesher Benat Yaakov. It's very hard to compress all this into one slide, but essentially up here, these red peaks are indicating high frequencies of burnt micro-artifacts in level V5, and then again here in level V6. Fire and specialized plant processing tools are nearly universal features of recent human hunter-gatherer adaptations. They are either unknown or poorly documented from earlier archaeological contexts in Africa. Stone tools from Gesher Benat Yaakov hint at possible links to Africa. Cleavers, these broader objects over here, cleavers at this site were made by striking long, broad, and thin flakes from large basalt boulders. And the scale is a little ambiguous. Your basic Gesher Benat Yaakov cleaver is about the size of a small thinner plate. Similar methods of cleaver production are known from older sites in Africa, such as Olduvai Gorge, Bed 4, Oligosyli, and Peninge. This technique of making these cleavers is not common among European or Asian Lower Paleolithic stone tool assemblages. Indeed, the closest parallels to Ubudiyya and Gesher Benat Yaakov in Eurasia are Spanish Lower Paleolithic sites estimated to date to around 500,000 years or younger. Early hominins dispersed into the Levant from Africa, but did any of them disperse out of the Levant into Europe or Asia? The distinctive stone tools found at Ubudiyya and Gesher Benat Yaakov are not found in European or Asian Lower Paleolithic assemblages until much later in time, after 500,000 years ago. Is it possible that nobody dispersed successfully from Africa to Eurasia through the Levant corridor? It's worth bearing in mind that there are other routes out of Africa. Other than the Levant, that is. Most of the other competitors, if you will, for dispersal routes require hominins to traverse water barriers of several kilometers. But we know so little about prehistoric coastal adaptations throughout the Pleistocene that many of these alternative routes are dismissed more for a lack of information than from valid evidence contradicting possible hominin dispersals. Probably one of the most productive areas of research, actually Mike Petraglia is with us, who's conducting research around the Babo Mendeb here, focusing on this area as a possible route of dispersal. We know very little about the archaeological record of the early Pleistocene in southern Arabia, and that will undoubtedly, when it's achieved, improve our ability to test hypotheses about hominin dispersals through routes other than the Levant. So was the early Pleistocene Levant a corridor or a cul-de-sac, a dead end for hominin dispersals? There are certainly many lower Paleolithic sites, but only a few of these are reliably dated, contain more than stone tools, and preserve hominin fossils. Glenn Isaac used to refer to these lower Paleolithic stone tools as Stone Age visiting cards, but these are cards from which much has been erased. In order to assess these various models of hominin dispersal, we need to consider some basic facts about the ecology of the Levant. Essentially, the region is a narrow strip of woodlands hugging the Mediterranean coast and the northern Jordan Valley. These temperate Mediterranean woodlands are among the most food-rich ecosystems in Western Eurasia. They're also sharply circumscribed to the west by the Mediterranean Sea and to the north by mountains. To the south and east, the woodlands are hemmed in by deserts that are only slightly more hospitable than the surface of Mars. Periods of extensive desertification in the Pleistocene Levant vastly outnumber periods of extensive forest cover. Not surprisingly, most archaeological sites of Pleistocene age huddle close by permanent water sources, and the regions most persistently covered by Mediterranean woodlands. If we want to know whether the Levant was a corridor or a cul-de-sac, we need to know how hospitable it was to hominin settlement. We need to know how many hominins could have inhabited the Levant in the Lower Paleolithic at any particular point in time. Now, this is a tall order. Estimating population size is one of the most difficult and contentious problems we archaeologists face. You want to drive an archaeologist crazy? Ask how many people were living on his archaeological site. So the next several slides are an experiment, a back-of-the-envelope calculation that I hope might shed light on this issue. Like I say, it's an experiment. Sometimes experiments go wrong. The surface area of the Levant corridor, a polygon enclosing all of the known lower Paleolithic sites, amounts to about 125,000 square kilometers. Of this, about a little bit less than 60,000 square kilometers are covered by Mediterranean woodland today. And the Mediterranean woodland is at its relatively most narrow time in recent Earth history nowadays, during this warm interglacial in which we find ourselves. Modern human hunter-gatherer population density in analogous temperate woodland environments, and most of these examples I'm citing are hunter-gatherers from California, range between 1 and 38 people per 100 square kilometer, with a median figure of 7 people per 100 square kilometers. If hominin populations of the Levant projected at median density value of 7 people per 100 square kilometers amounts to 4,200 individuals. That's a lot of people, or hominins. But this assumes early hominins were as effective foragers as recent Homo sapiens populations. There are some considerations that might argue against this. Some of these include the relatively late evidence for fire in the Levant, late evidence for processing plant foods in a systematic fashion, no evidence for hunting, and no evidence for storage. All these behaviors are universal features of even the least efficient of recent human hunter-gatherers who live in temperate woodlands like those of the Levant. Hominin population of the Levant at minimum hunter-gatherer population density values of 1 per 100 square kilometers results in an estimate of 600 hominins. The minimum size of a long-term stable human population is 500 people. Levantine lower Paleolithic hominin populations probably lived close to minimum viable population sizes. Demographically speaking, they were driving around on fumes. If they were significantly less effective at capturing energy from their environments than the least efficient of recent human hunter-gatherers, then for them the Levant would have been a demographic sink. From the minute they set foot in the Levant, the countdown to extinction would have begun. If this model is correct, or even an approximation of correctness, then it can help us to evaluate some popular models of human evolution. It is exceedingly unlikely that there was a single dispersal of hominins out of Africa, followed by prolonged continuity in all the regions into which they dispersed. It is also unlikely that there was the kind of sustained high levels of gene flow between Africa and Asia, as is imagined by proponents of multi-regional continuity. Rather, it is more likely that the Levant was a way station through which hominins dispersed rapidly. Those who lingered in the region probably became extinct. Thus, the Levant is both a corridor and a cul-de-sac, a land of opportunity and a boulevard of broken dreams. So, faced with such challenges, what was a poor hominin to do standing at the gateway to Eurasia in the Levant? They had three options. One, migrate quickly. It is difficult to assess the speed of Homo erectus dispersal, but it is telling that finds of these fossils in Georgia and Indonesia are nearly the same age as the earliest dated occurrences in Africa. Option number two, change their behavior. Evidence for big game hunting, controlled use of fire, occupations of caves and rock shelters all become regular features of the Eurasian archaeological record after 0.7 million years ago. It is possible that these skills were honed in the Levant corridor, but they would have had to have been honed quickly. Otherwise, early hominins would have been left with option number three. Option number three is extinction. Most species that have ever lived, including hominin species, are extinct. Some hominids successfully transited the Levant and dispersed into Eurasia between 1 and 2 million years ago. Many others undoubtedly failed. Both successes and failures contribute to the archaeological record. One challenge we archaeologists face is in finding ways to distinguish successful dispersals from failures. Paleolithic Plymouths from Roanoke's, Pleistocene Melbournes from Botany Bays. Thank you.